Amen. Thank you all for you singing and for participating by sharing your celebrations and laments. If this is your first time here, welcome. We are glad that you are here. My name is Craig, and I am one of the pastors here. And one of the big differences between Paradox and other churches is that sermons at Paradox are designed to start discussions and not end them. You may feel like I'm trying to impose my will on you. I want you to know that that's not my agenda. My hope is that these ideas that I share with you will start a discussion with yourself, with others you love, with people around you, about what it is that you believe and how we can become more loving people in the year 2022. I also want to take a moment and say thank you to all who make Paradox possible by donating at paradoxgiving.com. Just appreciate your generosity that you show us week in and week out to make this church a reality. With that in mind, we are in the Gospel of Luke, which is part 63 of our 66-part series through the Bible. We're supposed to wrap up in July, which I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. And we are in the Gospel of Luke. Last week we talked about Luke chapter 4, so today we're going to talk about Luke chapter 5. And we read in verse 27, after this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi. Now in 2022, we assume a tax collector works for the Internal Revenue Service, and if they don't work for the Internal Revenue Service, we'd be like, what kind of tax collector are you? But back in Jesus' day and age, tax collectors were very different than people who are employed by the Internal Revenue Service today. We have to talk about this system because if you don't understand how tax collection worked during Jesus' day and age, you and I can completely miss the point of this story because it's rather shocking. So let's go back 2,000 years ago to the Roman Empire. Roman Empire was centralized in Rome where the green star is, and the story of Jesus takes place in first century Palestine in a region known as Judea, which is where the blue star is. Now, let's just imagine a good Jewish person with a good Jewish name. We'll call this person Adam, who lives in Judea, right? Now, let's assume that Adam's tax bill is $1,000. That's how much he owes to the Roman Empire. So the question becomes, how does $1,000 get from Judea, from Adam's pocket, all the way over to the emperor in Rome? Well, the status or the structure they set up was a structure known as tax farming. And there would be a regional manager of tax collection. Let's give him a good Roman Empire kind of name. We'll call him Commodus, shall we? So Commodus is in charge of all of the tax collection in the Judean region. Now, Commodus has too many people to collect taxes from, so he has to outsource that. So he says, we're going to hold an auction for who wants to collect taxes from people in Judea. So a man named Maximus, who is most likely from Rome, shows up and says, I want to be the tax collector, and he bids $20,000 to be able to collect taxes from people like Adam. Now, you may say, why is it that he pays money to do a job? And the reason why is because once Maximus holds the contract with the Roman Empire to collect taxes, he can then jack up the prices on taxes from $1,000 on Adam to $3,000 and keep the money for himself. Now, Maximus is not an idiot because Maximus knows that if he travels to Judea as a Roman citizen, as a non-Jew, and tries to collect taxes, people will kill him. So Maximus goes to Judea and asks anyone who lives in Judea if they'd be willing to collect taxes on his behalf. And get this, he'll allow them to keep money above the tax bill and they can pocket it for themselves. So there were people who lived in Judea who were desperate, who wanted money. People like another good Jew with another good Jewish name named Nadab that was like, I think I'll do this. I'll be willing to collect taxes on your behalf. And Maximus says, great. I don't care whatever you have to do. Charge Adam whatever you want. Just bring me $3,000. So all of a sudden, Adam's tax bill goes from $3,000 to $4,000. And all of a sudden, Nadab pockets $1,000. He brings $2,000 to Maximus, and then Maximus passes $1,000 on to Commodus. Now, Nadab is not an unknown in the Jewish community. Nadab has a family. He has friends. He grew up in a synagogue. And now Nadab is charging his friends, family, fellow countrymen in order to profit for himself, and he represents the Roman Empire. In other words, people like Adam hated tax collectors like Nadab, right? Because these people betrayed their own friends, their own family, pocketed the money for themselves, and then passed the rest of the money up to Rome. So when we read about a tax collector named Levi, we need to know this is not an employee of the government. This is someone that the community thought was a traitor and had sold their soul for their own profit. So don't think of a tax collector. Instead, I have to ask you the question, who do you find is selling their soul and betraying our nation for their own profit? Yeah, right? Now, I'm not going to say a specific person, but I'm pretty sure every person here has someone in mind, and it's usually a politician from an opposing political party, right? I'm going to pick someone that doesn't allegedly belong to a political party. I'm going to pick oil lobbyists, right? This is who this person is in my mind. And we're going to refer to people like this as the soulless, shall we? So I want you to picture your person in your mind, whatever your political alignments are. Who is the person that sells out the nation for their own profit? Because that's who you're supposed to think of when you come across tax collector, okay? And we're going to refer to that person as the soulless. So we read, after this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth in the act of betrayal. And Jesus says to him, now imagine that you could actually see the soulless person across from you. What would you say to that soulless person? And while I have in my mind what I would say to people like oil lobbyists, Jesus says something very different than what I would say. And this is so different that it's inspiring, and it's inspired people for thousands of years. And in fact, one of the great masterpieces of Western art is a painting called The Calling of Levi by the Italian artist Caravaggio. And here it is, and Jesus says to him, "Follow me." Now, the reason this is considered a masterpiece in the history of Western art is because Caravaggio captures this expression on Levi's face that says, "Me? Why would you want me? I'm the soulless." And so that is why we celebrate this piece of art, because it captures this moment of shock, of this idea that the gospel goes to those who should not be part of the gospel. So Levi hears this call, he gets up, and he leaves everything behind, and he follows Jesus. Now, it's here that most people end the story, and they talk about other things. But in the very next verse, we read that Levi then decides to throw a great banquet for Jesus in his house. Now, this is an important question for every person, every Christian to ask. If you were invited to the house of the soulless, would you go over there for dinner? You'd be like, give me a second to think about this. Because here, Levi, the tax collector, who has betrayed his friends, family, and nation, is saying, Jesus, why don't you come over? And Jesus has a choice to make in real time. Do I take a stand and say, no, this is wrong what you've been doing? Or do I go and build a relationship with this tax collector? Well, Jesus goes. We read, there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. There's not just one tax collector. This is a national convention. And so they're sitting there, eating their food, and other people see them, and not everyone is cool with this arrangement, understandably. Particularly, there's two groups of people known as the Pharisees and the Scribes. Now, we have to know who these people are, otherwise we can miss the point entirely. Now, this is what Pharisees dressed like, and scribes worked for the temple. So Pharisees were members of the laity. In other words, Pharisees were not employed by any religious institution. They were more closely aligned with what we'd call a political party, particularly a religious political party. They really believed in the laws of Moses and making sure that they were followed to a T. Now, scribes were very friendly with Pharisees, and sometimes they overlapped. Scribes were legal experts who were employed by the temple to interpret the laws of Moses. Now, Dr. Diane Chen from Palmer Seminary describes Pharisees this way. She talks about how the sect of the Pharisees was known for its separatist attitude toward all that was ritually and morally unclean. In other words, Pharisees believed that if there were sinners and you were trying to follow God, you should put some distance between you and the sinners because they would detract you from your own walk with God. If there was somebody who didn't follow the same dietary restrictions as you, you shouldn't sit at the same table as them because you could become unclean by just associating with them. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably being quick to judge, just like me, but we have to have a little bit of empathy for the Pharisees. Because in the 700 years that happened before this story occurred, the nation of Judea, formerly known as Judah, has been through a lot. First, they were conquered by the Babylonians in the 6th century BCE. Then the Persians of 47 years later. Then later, they were conquered by the Greek Empire. They got their liberation for about 100, 200 years. And then the Romans, who are not even on the map, showed up and took over them, which is where Jesus is at today. So I can have a little bit of empathy for the Pharisees because if they were with us today, they would say, the law of Moses held our people together for the last 600 years. We emphasized what makes us different because that was how we built our identity. Without that, we would have just been lost and been a mere footnote in the history of this region. So for that reason, Pharisees often highlighted circumcision, religious purity, diet, and the Sabbath because it distinguished them, it set them apart from all the people around them. So these are the people who come along, they see Jesus eating with tax collectors, and remember, their whole idea is a separatist attitude. You distance yourself from sinners. And they go to Jesus and they start complaining to the disciples and they say, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? We're separatists. We try to put walls between us and sinners. Jesus heard them talking and answered, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So Jesus says all of these things, and it's this revolutionary moment where it's like, hey, you should build relationships with the sinners. And it's here that we read this story that we start to think to ourselves, okay, I got it. Jesus is the good guy. Who Jesus associates with are the good people, and the people who are critical of Jesus are the bad people. So we should associate with those who are willing to accept Jesus, like tax collectors, and distance ourselves from people like Pharisees who are bad. Which is really interesting, because 2 chapters later in Luke 7, one of the Pharisees decides to ask Jesus to eat at his house. Now, if you were Jesus, would you go and have dinner with one of the Pharisees after they criticized you for eating with tax collectors? Jesus goes and has dinner at his house. Now, at this point, if you're like me, you stop right there and you say, wait a second. Is there anyone Jesus won't share a meal with? Because once you start having dinners with tax collectors and Pharisees, you're really covering the whole political spectrum, right? It's not like there's a lot of middle ground, and these people are pretty much reviled by a lot of people in the middle. So Jesus goes to a Pharisee's house, sits around a table that is designed to be separate from others, that says you can only dine with us if you follow our dietary laws. You wash in the correct way. You follow X, Y, and Z. You are not unclean, and you keep Sabbath. And while he is there having dinner with the separatists, a woman bursts in and begins to wash his feet with her tears. Now, the Pharisees revile this because, after all, they view this woman as a sinful woman, and this sinful woman in their minds has no place at their sinless table. And while Jesus continues to eat with them and validate their existence as human, Jesus then stops them and welcomes this woman to the table where she is not welcome. When Jesus eats a meal with the Pharisees, he protests their religious separation by welcoming one who is unwelcome to their table. This is a movement that takes place around a table. And when you start to realize that Jesus is having dinner with everyone that he encounters, and anyone that wants to invite Jesus over, Jesus is like, sure, free food? Great. You start to go through the Gospel of Luke and realize there's a lot of meals in this story. For instance, there's a story in Luke chapter 9 where Jesus is teaching people on a hillside next to the Sea of Galilee. While he is teaching, there are thousands of people, and they all of a sudden become hungry. So what does Jesus do? Jesus sees a boy who has 2 loaves of bread, 2 fishes, and no, I got it right. 2 loaves of bread and 5 fishes, and he takes them and he multiplies them and he gives them to everyone that is sitting there, which raises the question, how big is the table of Jesus? It's rather large, isn't it? This is not a narrow, exclusive club. This is for everyone that can come close and see Jesus with their own eyes. In the very next chapter, in Luke chapter 10, we read a story about Mary and Martha in which Jesus reminds everyone that the point of meals is not the food itself, but the relationships around the meals. A few chapters later, in Luke 11, we read about another Pharisee who invites Jesus to his house for a meal. Jesus goes to another Pharisee's house, and he decides to tell them that they're doing some wrong things. And a lawyer stands up at this meal in Luke 11 and says, "You're insulting us." And Jesus says, "I know. Who cares?" Keeps going. We find another story where he goes to another Pharisee's house in Luke chapter 14. When he gets there, he tells 2 parables about banquets. Both parables are critical of the Pharisees in an attempt to change their behavior. Then in Luke chapter 19, Jesus is in the city of Jericho, and when he gets there, there's a tax collector that everyone hates named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus does everything he can to get the attention of Jesus, and Jesus says, "Hey, why don't we have a meal together?" And all of a sudden, Zacchaeus' life is changed from that moment forward. Toward the end of the Gospel of Luke, one of the last things that Jesus does before his death, he has a meal with his 12 disciples in the Last Supper. After that, he's killed, and then some people start to say that the tomb is empty, that Jesus has resurrected from the dead, but no one is really sure if it's happened. And all of a sudden, in the Gospel of Luke, there's 2 disciples wandering on a road to Emmaus who are joined by a stranger, and it's Jesus, but they do not know it. They do not recognize Jesus until they sit down and have a meal with him. And there's something familiar in that meal that they say, "Oh, we know who this is." And then the last, final act of the Gospel of Luke unfolds in a room with the disciples. And the disciples are sitting there. They're in a locked room. Everything's shut. Everything's quiet. They're fearing for their lives. And all of a sudden, the resurrected Christ appears. And they cannot believe it's him. They doubt whether or not it's him. So they say, "Jesus, prove to us you're real." And you know what he does? He says, "Give me some broiled fish." They give him a piece of broiled fish, and he eats it. And when they watch him eat it, they say, "Oh, it's real. The resurrection happened." How do we know? Because he ate fish. And when you consider these stories all the way from Luke 1 to Luke 24, you come to a realization that there's a lot of food in the Gospel of Luke, right? There's a lot of food that happens in this story. And Luke keeps telling stories about Jesus doing different ideas, sharing different ideas, talking to people, building relationships around shared meals. And when we ask this question, is there anyone Jesus won't share a meal with? The answer is apparently no. There's no one that Jesus says, "I can't agree with you, so I'm not going to sit down and have a meal with you." And when you consider all these stories, you look at this person right here and you're like, "Oh, this is the person, Judas, who betrayed Jesus." And here's Jesus like, "Okay, I'll have a meal with you too." And when you realize just how universal the table of Jesus is, it means that we have to do something in 2022. If we are serious about following Jesus, then there has to be something in our religious practice that is eternally universal and inclusive. There are no cancellations allowed in this practice, right? And there has to be something that we do where we say, "I don't care how bad you are, you can still participate in this because we're all children of God at core level. Even if you've wronged me 100 times, I'm not going to invite you over to dinner, but there's something else we have to do that reminds me of your humanity when I have a difficult time seeing it." I once heard the great Rachel Held Evans talk about this on a podcast where she said, without question, no matter how bad the person was that she knew, she would always break bread and drink wine with them in celebration of communion. Because if she didn't, then she felt like she was no longer following Jesus. This is the universal idea, the universal ritual that we remind ourselves that no matter who this person is, and no matter how many times they've hurt us or anything, we come back and remind ourselves that if they wanted to break bread and share from the cup, that we would come back to communion and remind ourselves that we're both human beings. So when we talk about this idea of the meal that Jesus shared, we have to remember that there's a universal application. That every human being that asked Jesus to have a meal with him, Jesus said yes in the Gospel of Luke. Now, another thing that we got to point out here is that the Gospel of Luke tells 11 stories about the gospel of Jesus Christ unfolding over a shared meal. Now, that's a lot of stories, particularly in a book that's only 24 chapters long, right? And when you consider that, you say, wow, Luke really captured the everyday life. I'm sure there's lots of stories about Jesus working and paying taxes and stories about Jesus just kind of living the everyday thing. I assume there's lots of stories about Jesus going to synagogue and being part of a religious community. But when you look through the Gospel of Luke, you realize there's not a lot of those stories. In fact, there are only 4 stories about Jesus going to synagogue and a story happening there. And instead, rather than capturing everyday life, Luke places a strong emphasis on the meals that Jesus shares with others. I point all of this out because if I were to ask you, where does the gospel of Jesus Christ happen in Jesus' stories? Before I read through this, I probably would have answered on some anonymous road next to some buildings. Some vague dirt road where there's this thing outside and there's people gathered around. That's where I picture the gospel work happening. But if we take the Gospel of Luke seriously, the majority of Jesus' work of the gospel unfolds around a table. And in Luke, Jesus did most of that gospel work over a shared meal. I tell you this because if I were to ask you to think of a sacred space, my guess is most of you would think of church. But maybe we're supposed to think about our dining table as a sacred space. One of the functions of the church, maybe, is to remind us that the gospel unfolds primarily at your own dining table, right? Maybe it's there that we can say, when I have people over to my house and eat a meal together, that is the gospel. And we have this idea that we always have to do more, or we have to go overseas, or we have to go help those people out there. And yet, when I read the story of Jesus, he did all of his work in an area of less than 500 square miles, and he did it all by just going to people's houses and talking to them over a meal. And I think that when it comes to what we need to do in 2022 more than anything else, is we need to recognize that our dining tables are all sacred. They are a sacred space in the house. Because when it comes to being a dining table, it's here that Jesus constantly just went to other people's houses or he shared a meal with others and he had this relationship with them where all of a sudden things started to change and unfold in dramatic ways. Your dining table is a sacred space. And when we often think about sacred spaces, we think of religious buildings like a church, instead of thinking about the dining table in our dining room. Which brings us to one last point I want to make about this idea of Jesus sharing meals with others. And to talk about this point, I want to tell you a story from a restaurant in Savannah, Georgia. Are there any people from Georgia here in the house this morning? Yeah, there's one. That's my wife. So in Savannah, Georgia, there is a restaurant called The Gray, and the head chef is a woman named Mashama Bailey. Now, if you're wondering if Mashama Bailey is good and her food is good, I don't know. I've read it's very good, but it looks amazing, right? Are you hungry this morning? So Mashama Bailey grew up in Savannah, Georgia. She lived there from 5 to 11, and she talks about it like it is just the greatest place on earth. And when she talks about Savannah, Georgia, she talks about the memories and the food she had and the family, and there's something about it that speaks to her soul. She grew up in the Savannah in the 80s, and while she was there, her parents noticed there was economic disparity across racial lines, and it caused a lot of concern for Mashama Bailey's parents. So much concern, in fact, that for them to be the best parents, they felt like they had to move away from Savannah and they moved to New York City. Now, Mashama's parents worked really hard to get Mashama's family into a middle-class neighborhood because they wanted their children to thrive and do well in New York City and in the world beyond. Now, when Mashama Bailey tells this story, she remembers this with fondness and reverence and respect for her parents. And she knows that her parents did the right thing. But she talks about what she lost when her family moved from Savannah up to New York City. Because everything changed that moment. She says this about that move. Back home in Savannah, it always smelled like food in the house, even in the middle of the day. In New York City, working in school was more important than cooking. Oh man, how many of you work really hard and noticed that your house kind of smells the same day in and day out? She goes on to say it wasn't the same, and then she says these magic words where she says, I felt like there was a piece of me that was missing. What are we talking about here? The smell of food. Now, we often think of the smell of food as a trivial thing, right? An inconsequential part of reality. But she says, when I stopped smelling food in the house, something was lost, and I felt incomplete. I tell you this story because last week I talked about how 2021 was a very difficult year for me. In fact, I went so far as to say that in 2021 I fell out of love with being a human being. It was so bad that I faced the worst depression I've ever faced in my life. And I told you last week that I've gotten in therapy and I've started antidepressants, and I'm doing my best to try to make sure that I can love being human again in 2022. Now, I told you that, and you know what your response was? You all came up to me and told me what meds you were on, too. We're a depressed people. Can I get a hallelujah? Yeah, if so, you're looking across the aisle right now and thinking, oh, they've got it together, let me tell you something. They don't. They don't have it together. We're all struggling. Why? Because 2021 was hard. We're in month, 22 of this pandemic, and none of us know how to live in this pandemic, right? We're a depressed people, and when you talk about what Mashama Bailey says, where she says, I felt like there was a piece of me that was missing, we've all felt that because it's really hard to have people over for dinner, isn't it? I mean, how many of you, I've talked to families who have met for generations on Thanksgiving who couldn't get along on a mask mandate or not around their personal family's Thanksgiving table in order to get together, so they just called it off. There's a lot happening here. And when we talk about we're missing that smell, we like to think that we're tougher than that we don't need the smell of food to have some sort of spiritual renewal. But Mashama Bailey, a James Beard awarding chef, says, no. If you miss that smell, you're incomplete. There's something human about sharing a meal together and listening to each other and looking at each other and saying like, oh, this pasta is divine. I've talked to my wife about our family's Lola. And here's a picture of my wife. She's in the white. Her sister Jack is in the Navy. And when I ask her to tell me about Lola Tangunan, she tells me mostly about the food that Lola made. She made some food like espasol and hopia, and then a vegetarian version of chicharron. Now, chicharron is traditionally made out of pork rinds, but my wife grew up vegetarian, so our Lola would make a vegetarian version out of gluten, and my wife said it was the best. And as she tells me this, she says, since she passed away, I have not had vegetarian chicharron again. And as she tells me the stories, her face lights up, she remembers her grandmother, and it's all in the way that she tells me the food used to taste. And it reminds me that Lola's spirit is tied to the food that she made. And you could just say it's just espasol, or it's just hopia, or it's just chicharron, but ultimately, it's about a memory, a relationship, and a human spirit that was poured into those with love. When we talk about a dining table, and we talk about where the last year has led us, if you're depressed or you're anxious or you're struggling to love being a human, notice that what we have been missing are frequently shared good meals with each other, and it's missing and it's causing us to ache and long for a time when we can be together again. You don't have to feel like you're inferior or you're doing something wrong if you're missing this, because we're all missing it. And while we found times to get together and eat over a meal, we all know it's a lot more complicated than it should be. My friends, may we remember that a good meal shared with others is always a celebration of humanity, and that a good meal shared with others is the gospel of Jesus Christ. My hope is that after today is that you will stop picturing the gospel of Jesus Christ unfolding on anonymous dirt roads, and instead see the work of Jesus unfolding on a dinner table, not only 2,000 years ago, but in your own home as well. May you taste, may you drink, may you eat, and may you enjoy the goodness of what it means to be human. And may you experience the gospel at your sacred dining table. Amen.